Welcome back to another video. I'm your host, John Botaraya. In today's video, we're going to be debunking some common sonar myths. So I'm going to start the video by going through some basic sonar operation. Then we're going to go through some underwater sonar acoustics. Finally, we're going to be covering a little bit of hardware. And then to bring everything together, I'm going to explain to you how to apply these concepts to some common sonar scenarios. So by the end of this video, you should be able to better identify fish, structures, and even possibly classify the species of fish that you see on your sonar. So now let's review some basic sonar concepts. So sonar stands for sound, navigation, and ranging, and it's a method for detecting objects and determining their location by looking at the sound waves and their returning echoes. So this brings me to my first common myth. Sonar uses light or radio waves that penetrate through the water. I've heard this multiple times repeated. This is just blatantly false. Sonar uses sound. So another important property of sound is that it travels at a near constant speed. So this predictable behavior allows us to measure the depth of the bottom and or nearby objects by performing simple math. Sound waves diffuse as they move through water. So as they travel, they get bigger and they spread out. This is why you see a sonar cone that is like a flashlight. Sound waves reflect off of objects. Different objects have different ways of reflecting sound. So objects such as fish, rocks, trees, they all reflect sound in different ways. Sound waves also have intensity. So they can be amplified. They can either be quiet, they can be loud. Think about this like you are turning the volume up on your stereo. Sound waves can even be absorbed by objects in the water. Absorption depends on the material. So materials like mud or clay, which represent a soft bottom, absorb a lot more sound waves than a rock bottom. So sound waves can also be higher or lower frequency. An example of a higher frequency sound wave might be the sound of a jet plane passing overhead. From a fish finder standpoint, high frequency sound waves are generally corresponding to side scan and downscan technologies. Low frequency sound waves, such as a heartbeat, contain less energy but produce a much wider cone. These are typically used in deeper water. So now we'll get started with some quick sonar terminology. The head unit interprets sonar data received from the transducer and displays objects on the screen in different shades of colors. They also typically have GPS and other features. Most important, though, is the transducer. It transmits the sound waves and receives the corresponding echoes. So transducers can be either single or multiple element. So a single element transducer typically has a piezoelectric element that it uses to generate a sound signal. That signal is then transmitted and received with the same piece of hardware. For example, a good way to think about this is think about a speaker. The speaker is also used to send and receive the signal. In a multi-element transducer, just like the one here, multiple elements are used to send and receive signals simultaneously. An example of this would be a speaker and a microphone, whereas the speaker is transmitting and the microphone is receiving. It turns out there are some pretty substantial differences between transducers in terms of quality and price. So a single element transducer is typically going to create a much blurrier image. And you can see on that picture there, the level of definition is significantly worse. On a multiple element transducer, which are about $500 and up, you'll see a lot higher definition than you would on a single element. This brings me to my next common myth. There's not that much of a difference between cheap and expensive fish finders. This myth is false. As previously stated, the difference between a single and multiple element transducer can be easily observed. The clarity of the images produced on a multiple element fish finder are significantly better than a single element, and this is because a transducer can send and receive pings at the same time. This means that you can send and receive thousands of pings versus a fraction of that on a single element transducer. Transducer produces a series of pings. The pings diffuse through the water column to make a cone-like shape as seen here. Based on the user's selections on the head unit, the pings can be either high or low frequency and can produce cones with different sizes. In general, high-frequency pings equate to a more narrow cone, while as low frequency equates to a wider cone. To illustrate this concept, as the boat moves across structure on the bottom of the lake, the sonar unit and transducer sends out a series of pings. As the pings bounce off the bottom, the return echoes are then recorded and visualized on the head unit depending on the color palette selected by the user. Higher intensity colors such as yellows, blues, sometimes even reds depending on the color palettes, can indicate a harder or more dense-like structure. So now I'm going to review perhaps one of the most important topics of understanding your fish finder screen, which is how to interpret fish finder arches. A fish arch is created when a sonar cone passes over a fish. As the fish enters the cone, it swims directly underneath the boat and exits through the side of the cone. The perfect fish arch is created when a fish enters and exits the sonar cone at the same exact depth. So it's like you're going over a fish at the same exact depth. This is because both sides of the arch are drawn as the fish enters and exits the cone. The middle of the arch, where it curves upwards, is actually the point at which the fish is the closest to the transducer. Probably one of the most misunderstood concepts is that the fish arch can be recorded at a depth on the fish finder screen, whereas the actual fish is swimming at a different depth. That's because the depth recorded on your fish finder screen is actually the distance from the transducer. So if a fish was marked on the fish finder screen at 20 feet, that is 20 feet from the transducer. So it turns out interpreting fish arches can also be very difficult. In this example, I've pulled two different fish, fish number 1 and fish number 2. Which fish do you think is bigger? If you answered with either fish number 1 or fish number 2, I'm sad to say that you're actually wrong. This brings me to the next common myth, which is arch size is indicative of fish size. This is not true. So let's get into why that might be. Now, this is a long-winded explanation, and there's multiple reasons for it. So to understand this, we'll need to look at the physiology of a fish. So the most important organ in terms of its ability to be located by a fish finder is the air bladder. So actually, it turns out 90% of the return signal from a fish originates from the fish's air bladder. So air bladders actually inflate and deflate with fish movement. So as the fish dives deeper into the water, the air bladder actually expands. As the fish rises to the surface, the air bladder deflates. So another important concept is that air bladder size is not homogeneous across species. Some species, such as the carp, even have multiple air bladders. This could drastically affect the return signal that a fish gives off. So it turns out a fish's movement inside of a sonar cone can also have a drastic impact on how its target strength is perceived. So if you look at a sonar cone, you'll notice that there are There's a main section here, which is the brightest color, and then that's known as the main lobe. There's also two sides to the cone, which you'll see is denoted by a much lighter red color here. So a fish moving through the main lobe directly underneath the boat will actually have a much stronger return and therefore show up on the fish finder screen as a much larger blob. A fish that is located on the side lobe will display on the fish finder screen as a much lighter color. Depending on how shallow the fish is swimming and how close the fish is to the transducer can also greatly impact the signal strength returned from the fish. So it turns out the way fish is rotated in relation to the transducer can also have a pretty big impact on the way that fish is perceived on the fish finder screen. So a fish that is rotated along its axis about 3 degrees in relation to the transducer, typically if the fish is pointed down, the return strength should be maximized. A fish that is perpendicular almost, so almost a 90-degree angle to the transducer, would actually show up as a much weaker signal than one that is rotated slightly at a 2 or 3 degree angle or even horizontal along with the transducer. So in conclusion, arch size does not equate to fish size, and this is because of the properties of the air bladder, in addition to how the fish swim through the sonar cone and how they are oriented while they are swimming through the cone. And as you can see, all these environmental variables can drastically impact the size of a fish arch that you see on your fish finder. This is the reason why you should not use fish arches to guess the size of a fish. So now I'm going to cover the topic of the fish finder blind spot. So this means that you could actually scan over a piece of structure and not see fish, even though there are fish. So say you're scanning along a rocky ledge here and you come across a boulder on the bottom. Now what happens is your fish finder reads the side of the boulder and it thinks that that's actually the depth of the water. And so what happens is it stops scanning at the bottom, and so you have this blind spot between where the fish finder thinks the bottom is and the actual bottom. So this brings me to my next myth, which is my fish finder doesn't see fish here, so there must not be any fish. Well, that's actually false. Like we just talked about, because fish finders have blind spots, making that assumption can be dangerous. So suppose I asked you, what do you think these 3 fish are here on the fish finder screen? If you answered with, I don't know, I cannot determine that, then you answered correctly. That brings me to my last and final myth. So the myth going around is that fish can be classified based off of their arches. This is false. As previously stated, there's a number of different reasons why fish arches appear the way that they do. Because many fish species have similar properties in terms of their air bladder and their air bladder size in relation to their body size, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to definitively answer that question. Now, this is true for most recreational fish finders, but just to point out here that there are actual commercial fish finders out there that can differentiate between certain species of fish. These are professional grade fish finders that are in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. All right, guys, that's about a wrap for this video. Thank you so much for watching my video. Guys, we've gone through some sonar basics. I've reviewed hardware. I've reviewed how a sonar works. I've also gone through the 7 common sonar myths. I've debunked those and fully explained why they are myths and why they are not true. You know, I just want to kind of add here at the end, if there's any other sonar misconceptions that you hear, please feel free to comment below. We'd love to know what everyone's thoughts are on these. And finally, if you guys got any value from this video whatsoever, like, subscribe, share the video with your friends. If you didn't like it, please let me know in the comments as well, so I know not to waste my time on videos like these again. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you guys on the next one.